ho, 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 ho. No, that is not an attack on your character. It's just the holiday season. I'm actually recording this video on Christmas Eve. So if you see this video on or before Christmas, Merry Christmas from my family to yours. But no, festivities aside, this channel is usually about writing and books. So I wanted to think about what to do this first kind of introductory video in the channel for, and it kind of stems back to a conversation that I had yesterday during a Q&A session with one of my friends and fan of my work, Garrett. And so Garrett had asked me a question. He was asking me what inspires me to write, and I think it's a really interesting question, and I answered it for face value. The interesting thing is, after a further discussion with him later, getting more in depth outside of that Q&A, I found that I think I kind of missed part of what he was actually getting at. His question was a little bit deeper than just, you know, where do the ideas come from? That was part of it. But what it did is it spurred an interesting discussion between the two of us, and it kind of gave me an idea, a platform, if you will, of kind of where I want to go with the first couple videos. And so we're going to kind of go through this probably in a series of videos. I'd like to go through and talk about kind of how my creative process, my writing process works. And this, if you're a fellow writer, I'm really interested in you chiming into the conversation. I'm curious if your creative process is similar, if it's different, if you have a different way of going about it, kind of how your mind works, how that creative process works, how the juices flow for you. And then, or if you have a totally different process, I'd love to know that as well. But I'll kind of explain the genesis of that creative process and kind of what causes me to put my foot on the gas and really stay productive and be productive in the midst of crazy busyness and chaos and trying to always push forward and make time to write and to progress and get these stories done. So for me, what I have found when I kind of look back on the writing that I've done, especially in the last few years, the different stories that I've come up with, whether they've been short stories, novellas, or full-blown novels, I think that there's one thing that is really consistent for me. I think almost each and every time where I've made significant strides, significant progress, and really committed to a particular work, rather than one that maybe I started and didn't finish, I think the one thing in common was always that there was a really strong character or cast of characters that really propelled me and fueled me into this creative vision to go ahead and launch off and write this story. So I know that a lot of a lot of writers say that they create character-driven fantasy, character-driven stories, and a lot of readers want character-driven stories. Well, I think that that's a fantastic, tagline or byword to use. I know for me, though, that's really how the creative process works. For example, the discussion that I had, let me grab a book here, discussion I had with Garrett, he was asking me specifically what was my inspiration when I was writing the Chronicles of Orion, which is, I'll hold it up here, I have a copy of it, see if you can get a real good look at that, the Chronicles of Orion. This is a novella, so it's not very thick, you can see that here. It's a novella that I wrote that, I'll get into the genesis of it in a second, but it was written to serve as a prelude or a prequel to Dragon's Fire, my full-length epic fantasy novel. And the beginning of this is actually kind of interesting because, for those that don't know, Dragon's Fire was actually my first novel that I wrote. That was published back last year, 2015, and when I started working on book 2 in that series, I really had some ideas for some characters that I just couldn't get these characters out of my mind. One in particular is Vaudrin Lightwell, and he is this big guy right here. You can see he's a heavily armored guy. He has a big sword right here in his hands. He's an older guy. He's a veteran. Basically, the concept for this character that I had was really that he was this champion of the light. He was a holy warrior. You can think of a you know, like a Knights Templar, a Crusader, or even like a Paladin, you know, in the traditional sense, like D&D sense, or even in the World of Warcraft sense. This holy warrior, this mighty champion of light and order and all that is good, veteran, he's seen a lot of things, but he's this guy who's definitely fallen away from not only his faith, but he's really fallen into some struggles, some temptations, and he's really has a secret battle that he's losing. And this character, the struggles, the trials, and everything that he has to go through, it's this character that I visualized him. I saw him. I saw this older, grizzled veteran warrior and commander and champion who he was embattled on so many levels. Not only is he trying to lead war campaigns and he's dealing with politics and different things, but he's dealing with internal struggles, real demons that are very real, that are very just honest and open and transparent, and getting to have the conflict where he just has to fight through that, and maybe he'll come out the other end and maybe he won't, but he won't be unscathed either way. And so I had this idea, this vision of this character, and he just wouldn't go away. So what I did is I initially started writing short stories, specifically just the initial image. I was just trying to get that image on paper. See if I can find it here. Give you a little sample. Bear with me a second. I probably should have been a little bit more prepared. We'll get to it in a second. So there was basically just a few opening lines that initially, I mean, when I visualized him, I was like, I really got to write about this character. I don't know where it'll go. I don't know what'll come of it. Don't even really know this character too well yet, but I had an image and I really wanted to write something down to try to see if there was anything to go with it. And this is what I came up with early on. And it says here in the Chronicles of Orient, it says, Vaudrin locked the clasp of the iron brooch. The hardened jaws of the engraved mogbeast held the fabric tight. The luxurious violet cloth was draped over the bulky, golden-hued armor that encased him. Some called him a paladin, some a crusader, and yet others still a Templar, but by any other name, Vaudrin was a 𝓓𝓞𝓝, a champion of the light. It was a light that had all but vanished. It hadn't always seemed so dim, though. Like his long gray hair, the deep lines that doubt and worry had etched into his face revealed an age that his muscled body would try to deny. Like his fathers before him, Vaudrin had spent his entire adult life, close to 40 years, in the service of the Church of Providence. So that's just a little introduction to Vaudrin there. So what I had is, as you can tell from the two paragraphs there that I read, I had this very visceral image of what this Vaudrin Lightwell would look like. So once I wrote that down and I got that in there, I just said, okay, I really want to see where this character goes. So I started writing the story, and eventually a whole story just kind of blossomed out of this. Now, a lot of writers would call this the gardening technique, where you don't have a particular outline, and that's how I wrote with this. I basically said, let's see where this is going. I don't have a particular outline in place, but let's just go with it. And as I was gardening, as I was writing this out, or typing it out, so as I was writing this out and putting it all together, this story just started to form. Now, it was a very small story, but this story was really interesting. It was really engaging for me, and I had a really fun time writing it. So from there, I was like, well, there's a couple other characters that are starting to come into this mix. There's this 𝐬srith, this witch queen 𝐬srith, and then there's her twin brother Genji, and he's meddling with sorcery, and she's power hungry for sorcery as well. And I'm like, wow, these characters could be pretty interesting if I develop their character correct. So where does this go? And what happened is I started having multiple characters with multiple storylines coming together, and they were starting to be really fun and interesting. And then I said, okay, well, this was this was a fun experiment, but I need a little bit more direction, because if I see that these stories are going to come into something, if I want to put this together into a finished piece, I need to have a plan. So then I did what I normally do, and I went through the process of establishing a little bit of an outline for that particular set of stories. And I finished those stories. I finished those stories, well, at least I thought that they were finished. And so what I did after that is I had all these other characters through the writing process that, like, oh wow, I really want to write about this scarred orc war leader who becomes imprisoned and enslaved, and I really want to deal with the racial tensions between the humans and the orcs in this particular part of the world. And so I write about this, and then all these ideas started sprouting, and I'm like, wow, this is fantastic. I really got to dive into this. Well, as I started putting together this small collection of short stories, what I realized is, wow, there's a way that I can take all these stories. There's a common thread I can weave through all of them, and I can put them all together to create one larger narrative. And so through that process, I got back to stepping away from the gardening model, which had kind of created all these great separate stories, but none of them flowed together because they weren't intended to be one individual narrative. So what I did then is I said, well, how can I take all these different events through a large span of time in the history of this world, and how can I connect them? And so what I did is I came up with the idea. I said, what if I take a story where there's one particular thread that we know is weaving all of these events together, and we create a framework, a narrative framework that we can set all these events inside of this one framework, and we can narrate it from outside of that framework. So that's where the idea for 𝓚 and 𝓟𝓛, the two priests that are on a journey to uncover an elder stone, basically, which is this artifact that's been long lost, and that elder stone is the thread that weaves its way throughout the narrative. So we came up with the structure of what the book actually is today, and that is these two priests, a senior priest and then his young protege. So we have 𝓚 and 𝓟𝓛. They're on a quest to uncover this long lost artifact that, when they find this artifact, the world as they know it is going to be changed. And so they're on a quest to do it. Well, as they go on this quest, 𝓚 is teaching his student 𝓟𝓛 the history of basically this artifact. And so you learn these little individual stories. You learn them as they go throughout the story, and you get introduced to all these various characters, and then in the end it all ties together in a nice pretty bow. And then at the end of the book, the nice thing is once that whole narrative framework is completed, it's all woven together, and then you get to the tail end of the outer framework, the end of the narrative with the priests, what you have is a nice pretty bow on it that basically sets you up perfectly to enter into Dragon's Fire. Now, Dragon's Fire does have an entirely different cast of characters, but the great thing is, by reading this action-packed novella, you're perfectly set up to have a good foundational understanding of Dragon's Fire, and it's fun too. It should be a fun read, quick read for those who haven't grabbed it yet. But the great thing too is, for the people who have already read Dragon's Fire, the great thing about the Chronicles of Orion is it really helps actually set you up for Book 2, which I'm currently working on right now. So Book 2, The Halls of the Fallen King, is the book that I'm actually working through right now. I've written the first draft. It's already completed. I'm actually going through the first round of revisions right now, and then I'll be going into beta. That book I expect to be out sometime next year. But the interesting thing is, in that book, there's a lot of concepts and things that haven't been touched on yet in Dragon's Fire. Well, the Chronicles of Orion really helps lay a good foundation so that understanding, that transition will be really smooth. That's part of what took so long to get the Chronicles of Orion out, is to make sure all that was fleshed out very nice and smooth and easy for the reader to digest. So really good. So if you've read Dragon's Fire, you'll still want to pick up the Chronicles of Orion. It should be a lot of fun, but it will also really help with the next book. And if you haven't read either of them yet, this is a great place to start. You don't have to, but this is a really great place to start. But anyways, so I'm not going to ramble on any longer. That's a little snippet of how I started out with the writing process, especially with the Chronicles of Orion. Keep coming back, hit that subscribe button, because we're going to go into more details with other characters in the next videos coming up. All right, love you guys. Merry Christmas. Bye.